Welcome to today's webinar on assisting culturally diverse clients. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are holding this webinar today. In Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and Yagara people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, I'd like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a warm welcome to any First Australians listening today. This presentation and webinar is for professional development and education purposes for Community Legal Centre staff and is not intended to provide legal advice. It is not to be used for commercial purposes without the express permission of the authors. Information is current as of the 30th of April 2019. We'd also like to ensure that you feel safe while accessing these training materials, as some content may be disturbing or upsetting. If you feel triggered, we encourage you to use your discretion as to whether you should continue listening. You can access additional information, resources, or professional support or advice from CLCQ's Keep Safe website page. Today, we are joined by Rob, Education Officer from Brisbane's Refugee and Immigration Legal Service, and Ingrid from Immigrant Women's Support Service. They will discuss practical tips for assisting culturally diverse clients, domestic violence and the Migration Act, and working with interpreters under the recommended national standards and Queensland's relevant Magistrates Court practice direction. I'll now hand over to Rob and Ingrid and talk to you again at the end of the session.
Hi, okay, it's Rob here. I'm from RAIL, the Refugee and Immigration Legal Service. We're a specialist community legal centre dealing with refugee and immigration law issues. We have a very large casework of domestic violence, family violence under the Migration Act cases, and we do work in Brisbane and throughout the regions by phone and advice and some outreach services, and we have quite a wide professional and community education program as well.
Good morning, I'm Ingrid Green. I am the senior caseworker at Immigrant Women Support Services. We support women from non-English speaking backgrounds or cold women. Our cohort of women, our youngest client is 15, our eldest client is 78. We support women that have been subjected to domestic and family violence and or sexual violence.
We'll be looking at the issues and practical tips when working with culturally diverse clients, the domestic violence provisions under the Migration Act, and then working with interpreters. So the first part will be looking at some cultural issues, and family violence, of course, crosses all cultures and social groups. The UN estimates around 35% of women worldwide have experienced some intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. And of course, there's similar issues across all cultures of seeking power and control through intimidation, threats of physical assaults, and that perpetrating violence is the choice that people make. And so people facing family violence in culturally diverse homes and in situations that we're talking about face the same problems as mainstream people, but there's added barriers and disadvantages. And of course, we must always be wary of stereotyping and making assumptions around culture. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Domestic violence in the home country is one of the root causes and strong push factors for trafficking. So women and girls become easy prey for traffickers, seek a safer life elsewhere. There is a program to support people in that situation. We've got the link there, and there's also the anti-slavery organisation. So that would be the first port of call to go to get some assistance if clients or people that you know are in that situation, as well as legal services. I've got a little bit of research up there which was done by ANROS in 2017. A little bit hard to see, but it looks at how attitudes have changed from 1995 to 2017. I'll just point out a couple of things which are quite interesting, which is around the knowledge of the prevalence of violence against women. 72% of people think that violence against women is common in our community, which leaves 30% who don't. And only 81% think that it's a criminal offence for a man to have sex with his wife without her consent. So around 20% of people think that you can rape your partner in marriage. And 60% say that if they needed to get advice, they would know where to go, which that means 40% of people don't know where to go in situations of family violence. So there's some interesting statistics and set a bit of a scenario for where we're going from here. In terms of cultural issues, Ingrid and I will talk about these for a little while. I'll just outline a few of the key areas. Of course, limited English creates barriers, lack of understanding of the legal system if you come from a system which is different to the Australian one. A mistrust of authorities can happen, particularly for people who have been abused by authorities, such as refugees. Services are not equipped for non-English speaking clients often. Some are and do a very good job, but not all. There's cultural biases and stereotypes that we all have cultural bias of some sort, and we need to deal with that. And working with interpreters, when do you need one? How do you assess their competence? How do you obtain interpreters in some dialects? They're issues that we will talk about towards the end of this webinar. And for some people in some migrant and refugee groups, some of these cultural issues will apply. There might be a stronger motivation to keep families together, particularly if you come from overseas and your family has been split up, and you're coming together, and say you're a refugee family, for instance, there's going to be a strong pressure to stay together, and even if that might be an unsafe relationship. Problems are often sorted at home through religious and community leaders. This is something that people are used to in some cultures. Divorce is frowned on in the community and in the religion, and difficult to get religious separation. It's quite different to what the mainstream view in Australia is around divorce and separation. It's much more accepted in Australia than it may be in some other places. There's strong traditional view of male as the authoritarian head of the family. That can apply. Patriarchy crosses all cultures and all countries, has over throughout history, and things are changing, but still there's some very strong views that some people have. Using force as the accepted way to discipline or get your way is another attitude that may be prevalent. And seeing violence as only physical and not the other aspects of violence and family violence around the psychological, economic and cultural abuse that we know of as domestic violence here in Australia. And the dowry system may operate as a pressure to stay as the dowry has been paid. There's been a report on that, a recent report on that around dowry abuse. So we talked with some DV lawyers a while back, and some of those issues, the issues that they came across were, how do you advise or convince female DV clients to actually start proceedings? Some women actually considered a beating was a demonstration of love. Some clients had high expectations of justice, that things could be sorted out very quickly, that the lawyer would be able to do everything, and it would be very quick. So that is an expectation which doesn't always work and come true. Male clients not wanting to deal with women lawyers is another thing that we have faced. And of course, the opposite is when, say, a woman is is as a client before you in a DV situation, then here at Rails, we would obviously try and get a woman worker to lawyer to work with that person. We do have times where the male lawyers, migration agents work with women, but certainly not in sexual situations. And dealing with victims of torture and trauma, particularly refugee clients, we'll say a little bit more about that later. So one of the things that the DV lawyers raised was around tackling resistance to actually accessing support. So how do you do that? We had developed a forum theatre resource, live theatre, and then a video on our website. The link is there, looking at a whole lot of family violence issues and in culturally diverse communities. And we worked with the Queensland African Communities Council on that project. And so some of the things we'll look at now is around if somebody is in a situation, what is going to hold them back from accessing DV support? And these are some of the things that came out in that forum, and we'll talk about these in more detail shortly in some of the slides. We'll look at that, and Ingrid and I will have a little bit of a discussion around that. But some of the points were around stressing clients' safety and their children's safety. So point out that seeing, hearing violence harms their children. Work with trusted agency and community members and police cultural liaison officers. Stress confidentiality in all dealings with clients and in how your service presents to the public, and prepare responses to avoidance. So these are some of the things that people have come across, and on the left-hand column are the comments that women would make, that they wouldn't come and see a service because of these things. And on the right-hand column is some comments that we could respond to. So first, I won't go to see a DV service because it's not confidential. The whole community will find out if I go to a DV service, and they'll make me leave my family. So these are fairly extreme but not uncommon views.
Yeah, there's the point that I was talking to Rob earlier, and that is the use of language too when you're talking to a COD woman regarding DV and leaving the relationship. That part of that process may be that she has to go to a shelter or a refuge. And in some languages, that word shelter and refuge has a very different meaning. We've had a couple of women that have refused to, and when we unpack that further, it was more of the fear of what shelter and refuge meant to them in their country of origin. So if you're coming from a war-torn country, a shelter could be somewhere that's not safe, but it's not good and more traumatic, rather than going to a safe place to stay and live temporarily.
Yes, and so also stressing around that DV services and lawyers must keep your information confidential, and having that very clear within your service, the public face of your service, and having that known within the community is very important. Some people we've heard of haven't gone to DV services because somebody in the community saw them walking into, say, a lawyer or a service, and that got around, and then it caused quite a bit of fear and problems because people weren't able to or weren't feeling trusted. Sometimes there's the issue that people think you only go to counselling if you're crazy or it won't change things, or counselling just doesn't work. You do a bit of counselling and then you go back and the man's still the same, or it's not talking more deeply. So trusted counsellors are well, how do you overcome that? Building trust, I think. People who have been helped by counselling could speak out about the benefits of the help they got to the community, and that's probably one way that word could get out.
Yeah.
And this one is a strong one too. We must stay together. It's our culture, our religion. There's big shame if the family splits. Sometimes elders say the families should stay together. There's that big pressure. Have you had any situations there?
Yes,
Ingrid?
so, I guess it depends where the women come from. And by that I mean whether it's a collectivist society or an individualistic society. So a collectivist society would have, that the woman sees that not just her immediate, herself and the immediate family as part of her family, but also members of her community. So a community can be a double-edged sword. We've had cases where women will stay in the relationship because other women or other people in the community have said, look, we're going to help him, it's going to be all right. Don't bring shame to our community by splitting up. But also a community can be quite supportive too when it comes to supporting the woman. So it depends on the relationship the woman has with her community and those people around her as to how that might work out.
And things where he will report the problems back to the family back at home. This is a fairly significant issue. You have a case?
Yes, we've got a couple of cases, one recently that I'd like to share with you, where the woman kept saying to us, look, he's going to hurt my family. He's told me that if I leave him, he's going to hurt my family. It's hard for us to understand that, those of us that don't come from different cultures where we can see or understand the far-reaching arm of the man that we've married. But in this particular case, what happened was that the woman had a mum lived overseas. The mother, an elderly woman, was living alone. There was a break-in. She didn't wake up to the break-in in the middle of the night. By that I mean the mother overseas. The mother had long hair, and the person that broke into the house actually cut some of this elderly woman's hair. So when she woke up, she was quite distressed and upset that obviously someone had broken into the house in the middle of the night. She was asleep, she didn't even know, and rang her daughter. And that was enough for the daughter to come back and say, see, that's his way of showing me that if I leave him, harm can come to my mum. And I guess that's very different from what we would see in our generic population. There's that threat that is followed through.
Yes. And there was that case, the Sri Lankan case?
Yes, a couple of months ago, I can't remember, I was saying to Rob that a young woman, a Sri Lankan woman went back to Sri Lanka. Both parties were Sri Lankan, husband and wife. She wanted to leave him, and she was actually killed in Sri Lanka by his family because she wanted to leave him.
So these are very significant issues to try and overcome. Some people also think that violence is a proper way to teach discipline. This is within the family, so this is of the children. Sometimes even the woman might have that view, but mainly it's the man is seen as the person to give the discipline. So that's a cultural attitude which how do you change that? Can some deep cultural traits be changed? We'll talk about that in a little while. And then there's the minimisation that happens with in all situations. Usually women will want to stay in the relationship usually, and the person who's being abused will minimise things.
Yeah.
And you'd see that
yes,
quite a lot.
We do,
yes.
yeah.
So there's some of the issues that women who are being abused, and of course there's situations where men are abused as well, but they're much smaller, a much smaller proportion of the population. With clients we have, it's a very small percentage of the clients. So the next part looks at the men's view, what sorts of things and attitudes might they have, which are cultural beliefs. And once again, we need to be very careful that we don't stereotype. But we've got some more points coming up, and so we looked at these in the theatre piece and the video called Help Me There. But we've also now just recently started up with some community organisations, a multicultural men's shed, where we're sitting around with men and talking about some of the issues around separation and family violence, and ways to look at that and ways to overcome those things, and ways to be able to form better relationships, and so that actually you will stay together rather than split up, and ways to possibly deal with violence and not get to that stage. So it's a preventative thing, and we're creating some resources, some videos and toolkits for men in different cultural communities, and some resources also for community leaders. Some of the issues, the man is the boss. This is as man is head of the household, and there must be firmly stick to our roles, issues that people have deeply embedded often, and that has happened throughout most cultures and societies, but things have changed, and it's now equal rights, and that men and women should be given equal treatment and respect, and learning to do that is a difficult thing for some people, but many do also learn and adjust and do that very successfully. Finances is a thing. Some men that we see, they arrive and they don't get jobs, so they're reliant on Centrelink. They feel their role as provider is undermined, and that causes problems within the household, and the man's self-esteem is threatened. People can work through that and work out how to share finances and view the financial situation as a shared thing, and often it's something that they do together for the children, and see it in that perspective. It is much more acceptable to the man. But say if there's split up and say if there's children, we've had many men saying, well, the Centrelink gives the money to the woman and the children, they can then get a house. Obviously it's not very much money that people get, but the man gets just one. He gets Centrelink just as a single person. So that can cause big problems. So we're looking at ways to talk with men around those things as well. Things I can do whatever I like in my home, and in my culture even I can hit her, but those things, and often they're myths about the culture. Sometimes it's just a different part of a society that might do that, and culture always changes, and whatever things may have been in a place where you've come from, things are different here, and people have to change and learn about it. And similarly with children, the way people teach teach their children can be strong ways of doing that which isn't reasonable discipline, which you're allowed to under the law here give reasonable discipline under the criminal code, but that can people can go beyond that, and it becomes much more than reasonable discipline. It becomes harm. So changing of culture to one where everyone respects equality for women and rejects violence against women, and where all Australians can live their lives free of violence or threat. That was Quentin Bryce, former Governor-General, and some work. We've done quite a lot of work at Rails with communities, and one quote from a woman from QPAS, the Queensland Program of Assistance for Survivors of Torture and Trauma, I've thought was really good. She said, people make culture so people can change culture, and it doesn't have to take a long time.
Yeah, it's organic.
Yes. We always need to be aware of stereotypes and our assumptions. So there was some issues raised in the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, that where police, when they attend at an incident, the perpetrators can appear calm and reasonable, and the woman may be agitated. And police need to be trained to identify that may be different. In some cultures, it may be it may be much more common to be loud, to wave hands around, to look as though you aren't dealing with things, and that you might be the perpetrator. And there was a very good podcast on big ideas, a recent one by Khadija Blah, who's a human rights activist, and she was a victim of family violence, and after she got a domestic violence order, she went to church, and the man, the perpetrator, was there at the church, and police came along, and their comments when she was making the statement about the breach of the DV order is that your men are more violent. And she's also told at the scene to calm down. The effects on her, she said, that it was to say your men are more violent is to minimise the violence and the effect of it, and you're expected to cope with it because it's something that is expected within your community. And she said she also felt at that time that she also wanted to stand up for her community and to say that, well, look, not all our men are violent, and so I'm here to sort of say that as well. So this was a stereotype that people often make, that from a particular culture, some people can be more violent or in a particular way, and that, of course, is not the case.
Mm-hmm. What I would like to add there, Rob, is that we also found that with the women that we support, so in our last financial year we had over 800 women that were supported at Immigrant Women Support Services, and out of that it was like a 50-50 that women actually were in relationships with Australian-born and bred men, and others were in relationships with men from same culture or similar culture to theirs. So what we found, just to validate the findings, is that sometimes women, so the perpetrator may present quite calm and collected. They know the system, they've dealt with police before, what have you, and the woman doesn't know the system, doesn't know the language, so she may present quite agitated. We've had a couple of women where they've been, where the DVO has been against her, And then through counselling and through other evidence, it's come about that, yes, she was agitated because he just hit her before, he raped her before. So when the police turned up, she was actually lashing out or trying to defend herself. So there's also that to bear in mind.
Yes, yeah. And I think the Royal Commission looked at that sort of thing, indeed. So there are cultural issues, deep cultural issues, once again, being aware of stereotyping, but they're things that working with culturally diverse clients are things that need to be dealt with and may surface, and of course services like yours, Ingrid, deal with those sorts of things all the time. So one other way, of course, is around language and getting information out to people, and knowing that the services are there and how to access them and trusting them. Legal Aid, for instance, they have got the Browse Aloud, which is all their information can be accessed through this program here that you can listen to or see in different languages. It doesn't have all the languages, but it has quite a few. So that's an interesting thing. The other things there, we've got obviously have information in different languages. We have raps that we've done in other languages. Things like this is working with communities to see where's the best way to work with them in a way that builds the strength of the community and families and people, but also brings out some of these very key issues. There's a confidentiality brochure that we developed, which any service can use, and they're welcome to use our template to develop brochures themselves if that's some things that they want to do. And of course, there's specialist services like IWSS that provide great service for culturally diverse clients.
Yes. So counselling is one of the services that we provide, as well as wraparound case management.
And also having women and workers who are from culturally diverse backgrounds is very important.
Yes.
Yep. And and that's one of the things that has been said often is in recruiting with services that we do look to try and hire people that obviously relate to our client group, but that can mean people with having different languages will obviously relate a lot more easily to clients. Although sometimes, on the other hand, if someone is from a particular community and it's a small community, there will be that issue of, I don't want to be seen with that person because they think that maybe they'll go and tell the rest of the community.
Yes, confidentiality.
Yeah.
So we have clients, so most of our staff are bi or trilingual. But I guess we give the client an opportunity of seeing a worker that's from that same culture and or someone else. And like I have 3 languages and sometimes I see clients and very rarely are they from my native tongue.
Yes.
But the fact that I am a cold woman, I think for some other women go, well, if she can do that, if she understands that, there's a level of mutual respect and understanding, I guess, that comes from that.
Yes. And over time, then that within the communities, that respect and trust is built up because people are being dealt with in a way which acknowledges and works with the cultural differences and issues that may arise. So there are a few of the issues around culture, and we'll now move on to looking at family violence and visas. This is a case load that Rails has, quite a large caseload. With this, it's very important to know that if you're not a migration agent, registered migration agent, you can't give migration assistance. It's a criminal offence. Even lawyers need to be registered migration agents to give immigration assistance. There may be deregulation of that for lawyers in the future, but that has there's a bill that's been before Parliament for a while to deregulate lawyers from that system and give them the ability to be able to give immigration assistance without being registered, but that hasn't gone through Parliament as yet. I'm not sure whether it will. So basically, with this, it's looking at mainly spouse-type visas and people who are on temporary visas. They're temporary type partner spouse visas, and normally the relationship has to, you get a temporary visa for, and that has to last for 2 years, and then immigration looks at your case again. If you're still together, you get permanent residence. But laws about family violence have been made to stop abuse, which was happening, which was serial abusers, serial sponsors. So they would bring in a woman on a visa and abuse her, and then go and get someone else. So these laws have been in for a while, so that the laws are that if you, several laws, one is that you can't sponsor more than 2 partner or prospective marriage visa applicants in a lifetime. They have to be at least 5 years apart. That can be waived in some compelling circumstances. There's recently strengthened sponsor character checks, where criminal checks are done for all visas, but all these types of visas, but the applicant is given the sponsor's criminal record, and however abusive partners can use visitors visas to get around some of this issue. Family visas, partner visas, are very high application costs these days. But the laws that were made from 1993 were that if your relationship broke up within that 2 years and you didn't get permanent residence, then you could still get permanent residence if you could prove that there was family violence, or if you could prove there was a child with the relationship, or the death of the sponsoring partner. It's interesting. So some statistics on that. So temporary partner visa applications from female applicants, around 36,000 on average. Family violence applications made under that category in 2015-16, only 530 made, which is, if you're looking at the statistics for the amount of the level of family violence that is experienced, that's quite a low proportion, indicating that possibly there's a lot of people, women, not reporting. So these family violence provisions, where you can get permanent residence for within the 2 years if your relationship breaks up, applies to basically partner visas, or if you've made an application for a partner visa, a fiancé visa, if the holder's already married, and there's a distinguished talent visa, a dependent child visa, where these provisions can also apply. So you have to prove first there's a genuine relationship and that there was family violence. And the process is that if the relationship breaks down, the Department of Home Affairs are notified. They send a change of circumstance letter. They assess the genuineness, and if the department thinks the relationship is genuine, then it looks at the family violence. If they think that there's no family violence, then it has to be referred to an independent expert. And that's for where there's not a non-judicial evidence, which is DV protection orders, which we'll look at in a moment. And then you can go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal if there's refusal. So looking at genuine relationship, the department has to look at financial, social, household issues and people's commitment to each other. They look at a whole lot of things around that to see whether or not the couple are in a genuine relationship. So that's initially to get the temporary partner visa. You will have to prove this genuineness. So the relationship then continues once you get your temporary partner visa. But so if the relationship breaks down, then you'll still need to prove again that it was genuine at that time. So the family violence must have occurred while the relationship existed under the law. It doesn't have to break up because of family violence, but that usually is the case. Family violence is defined in the regulations 121, migration regulations, which is conduct, actual or threatened, towards the alleged victim or family member of the alleged victim or their property, that causes the alleged victim to reasonably fearful or be reasonably apprehensive about their well-being or safety. And that's a very key issue around that needs to be proved. So how do you prove that? There's judicial and non-judicial evidence, either or. So judicial evidence is a court order protecting against violence. So that's that would be a final domestic violence protection order. A conviction of an offence of violence against the perpetrator is the sponsor in this situation, or an injunction under the Family Law Act regarding violence by the partner. If you can't get a domestic violence protection order, a final one, and there's many reasons why that can't occur, then you can try under non-judicial evidence. And what that is to get 2 reports from professionals. They need to be professionals from different professions, which are outlined in an instrument, plus a statutory declaration by the applicant, or a joint court undertaking. So the professional's evidence is at least 2 reports from different professions, and they can relate to different victims. And these professions are medical, police or child welfare, statutory declaration from social workers, psychologists or counsellors, or a report from a women's refuge or family violence crisis centre. We work with IWSS and many DV services to get those. And the report needs to be something which is not just a one-off. There has to be some therapeutic relationship built up between the client and the counsellor, the person providing the report. If the report is, say, by a doctor or police, then that could be a one-off thing. The police report is a one-off thing, but normally you would need to have built up a relationship with the client over a period of time. And the assessment, people have to be very specific about their observations, the evidence, and the opinion in the report that's presented as non-judicial evidence. The violence must have been during the relationship and caused the victim to fear for or be apprehensive about their personal safety or well-being, and the visa sponsor must be the alleged perpetrator. And Rails works very closely with different professionals around getting these types of this type of evidence. But there are women come up with a lot of issues in this area. The lack of knowledge of the process. Evidence is hard to access because of social isolation and sponsor controls. The documents and finances often. There's also department deadlines, which are very difficult and pressing when somebody's in a particular situation. You can come in at any time. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. There's also risk a visa is cancelled or refused if there's misleading information provided in the visa application, even if you didn't know that the misleading information was put in. Abusive partners often use false threats of deportation as another method of control. There's threats to take custody of their children if the applicant leaves, and a person would have limited financial support before getting permanent residence. These are issues faced.
Yes, things like, sorry, with that last slide, things like even accessing a health system. You know, you can't access Medicare if you don't have permanent residency.
Yes.
I mean, there's some visas that apparently you can, but it's very limited. Financial support from Centrelink, again,
Yes.
you know, if you're on a tourist visa and you've been subjected to violence, it's very limited, or
Yes.
student visa.
Yes.
Women believe that the perpetrator can deport them. That, you know, there's that genuine belief that they can, particularly if all the finances are controlled by him, and the taking of the children. Why? Because in some cultures, actually, there's a belief that if you break up from that particular culture, the children automatically go to the father or the father's family. So we've had cases where women actually have returned to their country of origin, leaving children behind because they didn't know that they had rights, you know, to fight that.
Yes.
So the vulnerabilities are quite high when it comes to, as well as, you know, depending on the woman, like I gave you an age span earlier on, but what I didn't give you is that we support women that are that are illiterate, but also women that have been magistrates in the country of birth. So there's quite or medical professions. So there's quite a large span of different walks of life and social understanding of the women that we support.
Yes. Yes, and that threat of deportation is really high. And I mean, if someone is sponsoring, say a man is sponsoring a woman for a spouse visa, if the relationship breaks down, not because of domestic violence, and the person withdraws their sponsorship, then you have to leave Australia if there's no other way you can get a visa. But in this situation, if it's a spouse-type relationship, then you have this opportunity to put an application in. The sponsor isn't the one who controls your situation, although they use that as a tool of control.
And I guess the woman believes that too, because what happens is that he'll say, look, if you leave me, I'm going to tell the Department of Home Affairs or Immigration. I think most women think of it as Department of Immigration. And sure enough, he might call or put the letter in saying the relationship is broken down. And then she gets sent a letter saying show cause rather than he. So she's the one that's putting the hot water, so to speak, rather than him. So that proves to her that he does have that power.
Yes, well, he does. And then at that stage, she needs to go and get legal advice very quickly, because there is a 28-day time limit usually on those sorts of letters. So people need to act quickly. Now, if you haven't got a spouse type visa, temporary visa, and there is domestic violence and you're in a relationship, there are situations where you may be able to get permanent residence via the refugee or protection visa stream. This is fairly rare, but we do have quite a number of women that say where domestic violence is endemic in the country, where if you were sent back, if you're in a relationship, or there's domestic violence, if you're sent back to that country, you wouldn't be able to get protection. You would have to try that threat and that fear of serious harm would have to occur in relation to wherever you went in that country. But there are cases where we have been able to get protection visas because the person is suffering a significant harm, fear, a well-founded fear of suffering significant harm on the grounds of, in this case, it'd be a particular social group, women in that country who are facing domestic violence situations. So
an example would be like Papua New Guinea?
Yes, indeed. So we have a number of clients from PNG who've got refugee visas because their safety can't be guaranteed
back home.
Back home. And then there's also the cohort of temporary protection visa holders now. So these are people who have boat arrivals in Australia. There's around 20,000 or so that are on temporary protection visas. This is not the ones on Manus or Nauru. They are here on 3 or 5 year temporary protection visas, and they have to prove that they're refugees every 3 or 5 years. If the relationship breaks down because of family violence during that time, and say if the woman has to leave the man because of family violence, she then has to prove that she's a refugee, and sometimes her claim may have been based on the man's situation overseas. So she needs to put in a separate application, and maybe her family as well. So there's lots of complications that will occur in situations like that. So for people who are not migration agents, what can you do apart from being services, DV services, client support, assessments of family violence, supportive referrals, facilitate good communication and support through the legal process. Rails has got our referral pathway there, and there's notes, and our you can just phone through, and on our website there's a form. So the last part, very quickly, is to looking at working with interpreters. There's a lot of issues around this, but I'll just quickly go through these slides. Obviously, when you're using interpreters, it's quite a skill. You need to allow a lot more time. You need to be aware that to get the right interpreter, sometimes certainly for a woman in a DV situation, you would need a woman interpreter, and that's what TIS, the Translating Interpreter Service, would do.
Well, we ask for a female interpreter.
Yes, and you explain the role of the interpreter and that they've got a code of confidentiality, and just you need to make sure that the client knows that they can question if there's any problems with the interpreter to raise them, and you also as the worker need to be aware and looking for signs of confusion that may be occurring between the interpreter and the client. You speak in the first person with short sentences. Look at the client, not the interpreter, when you're talking. Watch out for long discussions or confusion, and regularly check the client's understanding. Speak more slowly. Repeat, rephrase points, avoid jargon and colloquialism, simplify statements. Provide background information such as meaning of legal words and concepts. There's the Queensland Magistrates Court Practice Direction, number 6 of 2017, in terms of engaging interpreters in family violence, civil proceedings, not the police. These are for private applications. So where the applicant or aggrieved indicates an interpreter is needed, the registrar will access an appropriate interpreter. Queensland courts will pay to assist the aggrieved and or the respondent to understand the proceedings of the first mention. And if the court's satisfied that the justice requires an interpreter to assist the aggrieved or respondent, the court will appoint and pay for an interpreter in the Magistrates Court proceedings. Also, the Queensland Police Service policy have got a policy on the use of interpreters in domestic and family violence incidents, and the link is there. And there's also this Judicial Council on Cultural Diversity has put out this recommended national standards for working with interpreters in courts and tribunals, and it brings out it's a good document and well worth having a look through if you work with interpreters. It says that ensure interpreters for parties or witnesses with limited or no English. There's a 4-part test to assess if the interpreter is needed. Give the court notice as soon as possible. Interpreters should have the appropriate accreditation, which is NATI, National Association. National Association for the Accreditation of Translators and Interpreters, level 3, or paraprofessional. Use a video from interstate, then you have to have a voir dire, a trial within the trial to make sure that the interpreter is competent, or even a team approach where you have an interpreter from the client's language to one language and then another to another and then to English. Sometimes that it's complicated, but more experienced interpreters are needed for things like sexual cases and children and if the person's lower educated. Minimise clients' fears about trust and privacy by explaining the code of ethics, and brief interpreters about the court code of ethics and give them documents and time to prepare. So the 4-part test is there, and there's some really good, they give examples there around, so ask the party or witness about an interpreter. So, and using open questions, what do you think, for example, what do you think about asking an interpreter to help us? Or what do you want to do? Not like, do you want an interpreter? Yes, no. And sometimes that yes is a question would indicate that the person does want an interpreter, but no may not necessarily mean that the person doesn't need an interpreter. You need to be very careful. Assess the speaking ability. So ask questions that require a narrative response. For example, tell me about any jobs or training you've had. Tell me about something that happened after the police arrived. Assess the comprehension speaking relevant to the context, and so they have examples of writing out statements here and getting the client to explain back to you what you just said. And so they've got a table there where it's likely or less likely that the person needs an interpreter. So that's really quite useful. And then they've got these plain English strategies, which I mentioned a little bit just previously, but they have some really good examples here of active, not passive voice. You know, he was arrested. The police arrested him. He broke the law, so he was jailed. He broke the law, so they put him in jail. Avoiding abstract nouns. Provision of the act, or rather you'd say the act tells me what to do. Interpret my direction. Interpret what I say to the defendant. Or it has no strength. It is not strong. These sorts of things in lawyer speak, it's very usual to talk in abstracts, but with people of from non-English speaking background, you need to be very careful and just generally avoid negative questions. Isn't he the boss? Is he the boss? So you didn't report trouble. Have you reported trouble? This is basic good communication, but some really good examples there by the Judicial Commission there, looking at things, put things chronologically, one idea, one sentence, hypotheticals, yes.
So I think it's also important to, when an assessment is being made of whether a client needs or would want an interpreter, is that we support clients that have quite good colloquial English, like, you know, how are you today, how are you feeling, that sort of thing. Yes. But when it comes to being emotive, and you must, you know, we all know that if you've been subjected to domestic and family violence or intimate partner sexual violence, there's going to be a time where you're going to become emotional. And for all of us, I'm sure that when we are emotional, it's hard to speak, let alone when English is not your first language, and then you're trying to communicate and understand that. So even though their colloquial English might be okay, when it comes to particularly legal jargon, and it's scary, I think you have to be quite mindful in your duty of care that information is relayed correctly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's some other things there too. So it's all there in the PowerPoint.
Yes, and avoid metaphors.
Avoid metaphors, yes. I want to make sure that we're on the same page, so we'll have to avoid metaphors. So there's the interpreting services there. So very briefly, also in communicating with refugees, you need to be aware that they may fear authority, not trust government officials, and may suffer post-traumatic stress, and that causes lots of issues which can hinder memory, concentration, and people may not go to get assistance. Some clients don't show stress externally, but some deal with it better. Some don't respond to mental health treatment. Some will have support workers, and there's the support service, which is QPAS there. And here's just a few tips in summary of some of the things that we've been talking about as we go towards winding up this
Just one last point with interpreters is that some people, depending on the country they're from, may have a primary language but may have also other languages. So like with women from Africa and Western Africa, some languages, dialects are really hard to obtain, but they might understand Swahili, which tends to be more of a generic language. So also be aware that you might don't ask just for the one language or the language of preference, ask for others if it's, if you can't find an interpreter in that language.
Yes. And in some languages you can't. It's very hard. The small communities, it's very, very difficult. So I think that's about all except for one other thing, which is just the DV resources which Rails has. There's videos and language books looking at family law stuff, and that's all available on our website, and there's a couple of links there as well.
All right, thank you very much to Rob and Ingrid for their great presentation. If you'd like to type in any questions, I'm aware that we're a bit tight on time, but if you had any burning questions, you can also send them through to Community Legal Centres Queensland after the webinar and we could forward them. All right, so I'll give you a minute. I'd like to just say that this webinar was part of the Domestic Violence Capacity Building Program for Community Legal Centres, with funding provided by the Queensland State Government's Victim Services Funding Program, Building Capacity 2018 to 19. We had one question towards the beginning of the webinar about how a lawyer can culturally address the issue of marital rape in the context of domestic violence when the client is not ready to admit that she has suffered rape in such a circumstance. Do you have anything to say on this point?
I would suggest that refer your client, so work collaboratively, or refer your client to a counsellor where little by little, there's a lot of psychoeducation. So we do work with women that initially will come to us and will say, well, that's my job, or that's his right. And we have conversations around consent. So what does that mean for you? And there's just different strategies that we actually talk about. So one of the strategies as a counsellor that I have used with some women is, for example, if this was happening to your daughter, if you had a daughter, or if this was happening to a loved one, another fellow woman that you care very much about, what would you say to her? How would you support her? And different women come up with different opinions about that. But it'll have to be an unpacking and a psychoeducation around what is a healthy relationship, what is consent, and what's sex in marriage. So.
All right, thank you, Ingrid. That was a really great answer. And thank you, Rob, as well. We'll end the presentation here. Thank you for attending. The PowerPoint and a recording of the presentation will be available online. Thanks, everyone.